But if I'm being honest with you, that horror existed alongside a what I call capacious understanding of what it meant for me to do the work I was called to do. It was the young person who said, I'm being bullied at school and I don't know what to do. But listening to you helped me to realize that what I'm experiencing is not okay. And I'm going to stand up for myself. And I argue that because the black church, as we know it, as I know it, began in the antebellum South. It was a project that demanded recognition of black humanity. And so, if those of us who don't consider ourselves people of faith or religious decide that these are conversations that we don't need to be a part of, then it means that we are caught off guard.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Breaking Rank. I am excited to share this episode with you today. Today's special guest has spent his life in the spaces that ask people to leave part of themselves at the door. Reverend Don Abram is a queer public theologian and the founder of Toward Pride, a Chicago-based organization working at the intersection of faith, healthcare, and Black LGBTQ plus well-being. He grew up preaching in a Baptist church on Chicago's South Side, called to the pulpit as a teenager, and he knows firsthand what it means to be too queer for some rooms and too religious for others. He built Toward Pride, originally Pride in the Pews, out of that exact tension. What started as a project collecting the stories of Black LGBTQ plus Christians grew into a framework churches across the country now use to measure their own growth, from antagonizing all the way to advocating. And this year, that same framework is expanding into healthcare and wellness institutions, right as federal support for LGBTQ plus protections is pulling back. Don and his team are building care that doesn't wait on Washington to exist. He's a graduate of Harvard Divinity School, and his work has been recognized by Native Son as one of 101 Black queer men shaping their fields. But more than any title, what defines Don is a belief that people shouldn't have to choose which parts of themselves get to show up. Today, we're talking about his personal story, the founding of Pride in the Pews, the pivot to healthcare, and what 3 years of data actually proved about institutional change. This is Breaking Rank, and this is Reverend Don Abram. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I am beyond delighted to be here and excited to be in conversation.
Yes. And should I just call you Don?
Please
Okay.
call me Doctor.
Well, I'm so excited to have you on the podcast today. And just researching you and reading your story, I was like, wow, this is something that I really feel like our listeners will connect with. I think it's compelling. And the work that you do is very inspirational. And I want to give our listeners a chance to learn about all of the great things that you and your organization are doing. So just to start out, why don't you give us some background on who you are as a person?
I'd be happy to. So, the first thing you need to know is that I grew up in a hand clapping, toe tapping black church on the south side of Chicago. My Jamaican patois speaking grandmother would drag me to church every single Sunday. And if I'm being honest, I hated it. It was not fun for me. I didn't enjoy it. I would come up with all sorts of excuses as to why I could not go, such as not being able to find matching socks or the right tie. And I always say they should have known there that I was queer because the reasons I came up with were all around fashion and how I looked. But faith was really vital to who I was and the way that I moved through the world. And I often like to say that my first introduction to queerness was not in some club in LA or on some CD app. My first introduction to queerness was the Black church. It was an institution that existed on the underside of power. It was an institution that centered and prioritized marginalized communities. It wasn't until I got a little bit older where I recognized the limits of those love within the institution, but it really shaped who I am and how I move through the world and the work that I even do today. And so, if you don't know anything else, you should know that I'm from the south side of Chicago, which is the best side of Chicago. And my Jamaican patois speaking grandmother means the world to me. And the best gift that she could have passed to me is my faith. And that's what I carry into every space that I'm in.
Oh, that's great. And I can only imagine what the churches that you attended were like, because I also went to Baptist churches growing up. I always thought they were the more fun churches.
Oh,
Um,
yes. We have a time. Okay. The
yes,
spectacle, the pomp and circumstance. We have a
yes. I always thought they were so much fun. Although I did grow up, I had an uncle who was a pastor, and so I grew up where Sundays meant you were in church all day, like literally from the morning, and then you had the potluck, and then you had the praise service at night, then you had the Wednesday evening Bible studies and youth group, and all of those things. So it was all consuming. So I can
yes,
see how as a child,
yes,
it might
yes.
not have been as appealing. But you were called to preach as a teenager. And so what did it feel like to sense that calling while also knowing that you were queer in a space that wasn't built to hold you? Or did you even know at that time?
Yeah, no, that's a phenomenal question, and it's really interesting when those two things met. So, if I could, I'd love to tell you a story. One day after I had come home from school, it was a cold winter day in December of 2008. I had come home, and I'm always terribly cold in those winter months. And I turned on the heater, as I always do. I crouched down and I fell asleep. And when I woke up, I was not in my room, but I was transported into my home church, Greater New Mount Eagle Missionary Baptist Church on the south side of Chicago. And service was going on as normal, but I was a celestial being. No one could see me. I was simply moving through the space as Sunday morning at 11 a.m. Was ongoing. And I made my way into the sanctuary, and folks were shouting exuberantly, and they were
Hmm.
all looking toward the pulpit. And I began to walk down the middle aisle, and I was operating under the assumption that the person preaching was my then pastor, Pastor
Mm.
Frederick E. Wilson Sr. And so I walked toward, curious about what folks were excited about. And the closer I moved to the pulpit, the more clear the figure became. And I
Mm.
realized that it was not my pastor preaching, but it was me.
Oh, wow.
And that's when the dream stops and I wake up. And I had this moment when I woke up in front of that heater in my room, crouched down, saying, I know this doesn't mean what I think it means. I was cold. I didn't sleep well the night before. So we're just going to say that was a one and done. And that dream began to be recurring. And so
Hmm.
it wouldn't leave me alone. It was like this pebble in my shoe that I couldn't seem to get rid of. And eventually I asked the wisest spiritual person I know what that meant. So I talked to my grandma.
Hmm.
I said, Grandma, I don't know what this means, but this is what happens in the dream and it keeps coming back. And I said, Grandma, what do you think this means? And I think that's when my grandmother taught me one of the most important lessons I'd ever learned in life. She says, Son, I can't tell you what it means. Only you can, because only you know what God told you. And I named that that's my first introduction to queer theology. Uh, the belief that I have the spiritual authority and autonomy to determine what the divine is saying to me. Uh, and I sat with it, I wrestled with it, and ultimately realized that God was clearly calling me to preach. Now, there was this conundrum because you asked whether or not I knew I was queer. I knew that I was different, I knew that I found boys attractive, but I didn't even have language for queerness. I didn't even know fully what that meant, but I knew you weren't supposed to be it. And so for me, there was this reckoning of realizing that I had a choice to make. Either
Mm-hmm.
I could be queer or I could be called.
Mm-hmm. Wow,
And
that's powerful.
for me, the cost of being queer was too high.
Mm.
So I chose to be called.
Mm-hmm.
And so I accepted my calling to preach. I began traveling across the country, knowing that if anyone were to ever find out, I would not only lose my community, but I would lose the thing that I was taught to care most about, and that was my ministry. And for me, that choice was an impossible one. My queerness didn't disappear or dissipate. I didn't lose it. I didn't pray it away. It was still present with me even as I was living into what I perceived to be my call, but I didn't quite know what to do with it.
Mm. So, and what age were you around this time?
I was a whopping 14 years old.
Wow. Okay. Yes. So, yeah, you probably didn't have your whole life figured out at 14. But
What a surprise.
yes, but I can only imagine how kind of terrifying that might have been, having to feel like you have to choose between who you are and what you feel your purpose in life is.
Absolutely. I mean, I was utterly horrified by the possibility of anyone finding out, utterly horrified by the reality that this would be a part of me that I could never share or fully live into. But if I'm being honest with you, that horror existed alongside a what I call capacious understanding of what it meant for me to do the work I was called to do. I mean, before the church showed me the sting of exclusion, they actually inspired within me a desire to pursue justice. And so, even as I recognized that the church didn't necessarily have room for my intersecting identities, it did teach me the gospel of justice, the gospel of standing with and alongside the marginalized. It did teach me the importance of speaking truth to power. And
Hmm.
for me, preaching that and teaching that allowed me to remain true to who I was, even if I couldn't give voice or language to that part of me. And
Hmm.
so, even as I realized I wasn't able to fully live into it, it didn't mean that I had to betray myself in the
Yeah.
pulpit.
Yeah. And looking back, what carried you through the years before you had the language or the community for what you were navigating?
The thing that carried me through was every mother who came up to me and said, I was discouraged when I walked in, and after hearing you, I left encouraged.
Oh.
It's every grandmother who said, I don't know how I'm going to make ends meet, but listening to you gave me the strength to make it another day. It was the young person who said, I'm being bullied at school and I don't know what to do, but listening to you helped me to realize that what I'm experiencing is not okay and I'm going to stand up for myself. So, all of those stories reified the truth of me living into my call. And regardless of whether or not the community accepted my queerness, they did not deny the fact that I was called to speak to them in that
Hmm.
particular moment. And so, if
Yeah.
there's anything that kept me, carried me, encouraged me, it was the folks who came up after hearing me saying, I don't know you and I've never met you, but I know that you've been called to speak into my life at this very moment.
Hmm. Was there a specific moment where you felt like you were too queer or too religious for some communities? It just seems like that tension would just be present all of the time.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where I realized that it wasn't the church that, it's not only the church that has this problem. right? This sort of requirement that folks leave certain parts of themselves at the door as if it's the price of admission. Of course, I was wrestling with this in church, but I was also a kid from the South Side who attended Pomona College, right? A liberal arts school on the West Coast. And even as I was beginning to explore my sexuality, what I realized in those LGBTQ plus spaces was that my faith didn't make sense to them.
Mm.
They didn't know what to make of it.
Yeah.
They didn't know how to relate to and with it. And so here I am beginning to find the language and be in safe space where I might be able to lean into this part of my identity. But I realize that they're asking me to leave my religiosity at the door.
Do you think that was because they had been excluded from those institutions, and so they just felt like we're not welcome there, so we don't accept it, rather than, or was it they weren't exposed to it?
I think it's the latter. I think, broadly speaking, the LGBTQ plus community has experienced a tremendous amount of harm from religious communities. And as a result, they have often eschewed all kinds of faith traditions, presuming that those who ascribe to them, practice those particular religious traditions, are homophobic or transphobic themselves. And what I often like to lift up and highlight, particularly in those spaces, is that we have to be careful that our wounds don't bleed on other people.
Mm.
Because if we are not careful, we will find ourselves doing the very thing that we're critiquing the church from doing.
Hmm.
And so I name that my goal and work is not to convert you or convince you to adopt my worldview. That's not my work, whether I'm in the church or I'm in an LGBTQ plus center. What I am inviting both of these spaces to do is make space for the dynamism of our humanity.
Hmm.
And there's a way that I can acknowledge the way the church has harmed me or the way LGBTQ plus spaces have harmed me while acknowledging that these remain core parts of folks' identity. And if we are truly interested in making space for all kinds of human expression, we have to make space for the parts of ourselves that we have distanced ourselves from because of harm or trauma or
Hmm.
adverse experiences. And so I like to challenge both,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And saying it's not just the Black church that has to wrestle with compelling folk to leave certain parts of themselves at the door. It's all of these other institutions that refuse to make space for this aspect of identity.
Yeah. And some Christians would say that scripture is clear on the issue and there's no reinterpretation. You've said, or from my research anyway, that homophobia in the Black church is a byproduct of slaveholding Christianity, not the original tradition. So is that reframe fair or?
Not only is it fair, I think it's the most accurate and honest reading of what we are seeing today. I mean, we have to be honest about the fact that white slaveholding Christianity demonized and dehumanized the Black body. It decided that it would subjugate anything that it could not understand. And that was not only racial identity, but it was also sexual and gender identity. Because what we know is that before colonization, pre colonized Africa often honored and made space for various gender identities and sexual identities. That is proven, it is historical fact. Various tribes and culture made space and room, and beyond making space and room, these folks were actually honored in community as
Mhm.
spiritual leaders. And so when colonizers descended upon this great country, they decided that we don't understand your Blackness, your rituals, and your customs, but we
Mhm.
also don't understand all of these strange identities like queerness and like transness. And so what we are going to do is demand that you actually strip yourself of your inherent dynamism and force you, compel you to adopt our standards of normativity. So that means you need to be straight. That means it needs to be patriarchal. That means it needs to center whiteness. And that means that you need to rid yourself of all of these indigenous practices that you deem to be sacred in search of our approval. And so for me, when I think about the sort of manifestation of the mainstream Black church that we see today, it is actually a shell of itself. And I argue that because the Black church, as we know it, as I know it, began in the antebellum South. It was a project that demanded recognition of Black humanity. It's a project that not only honored a God who loved us as we were, but who believed fundamentally that we should be free. And so this is why I named that the work we do around faith communities isn't really about faith at all. It's actually about the recognition of shared humanity. And faith is a vehicle through which we get to that place. But it's not the only tool that we use, right, for our liberation. We were in these spaces crafting plans for liberation and freedom. We were in these spaces planning our escape. We were in these places thinking of ways to pour into and heal and make space for ourselves. And I actually believe that's the work that we've been called to do, whether we're religious or not. We've been called to pursue the collective liberation and recognition of the shared humanity of those whom we see as part of our tribe and community, and even of those whom we see as other.
Yeah.
And so the Black Baptist preacher is coming out in me, and so you
I,
can see.
I was just thinking that as you were going, I was like, uh-oh, he just found his lane.
And so I'll close in simply saying this: Black liberation, freedom, is fundamentally rooted in the recognition of our humanity. And any institution, any ideology, which strips the recognition of our humanity from us is adversarial to our collective freedom. And while it is true, I have spent my life challenging and critiquing the ways in which faith communities have done that. It is in my work with faith communities that I recognized that it's not simply Black churches that reproduce this kind of harm, but it's all institutions that have been shaped by, formed by white Christian nationalism and slaveholding Christianity. And it's easy to look to the Black church as the primary upholder of these problematic, insidious ideas than it is for us to recognize the way that our schools and our hospitals and our nonprofits and our governments have been shaped by these same ideas.
Yeah. What is the biggest or the strongest, maybe, theological argument against your position? And how do you personally answer it?
I think the strongest theological argument is a literal interpretation of Scripture. It is simply choosing to read the text out of context.
Mm.
And when you do that, for folks who are not divinity school graduates like I am, who did not have the luxury of attending Harvard Divinity School with leading theologians, not just across the country, but across the globe,
Yes.
then you don't have the tools, the exegetical framework, the theological dexterity to be able to interpret the text while maintaining fidelity, right, to the historical context of the text. And so I think in so many ways, literal readings of the text is the strongest argument because it is absent of nuance, it is absent of critical thought, and it is absent of historical truths and realities. But for me, when you apply Aramaic and Hebrew and Greek to your analysis, then that wholly, completely, and wholeheartedly undercuts a literal reading of the text because it has undergone various translations. And so my invitation, even to those who are listening, is to consider reading the text in Aramaic. Consider reading the text in the Greek. Consider
Just a little
reading the
mild flux there.
in Hebrew. And when you do that, I would ask you to juxtapose that with your literal reading of the text and see if you come away with the same thinking.
Ooh, I love that. I would love to see someone debate you. That would be fun. Maybe I should host a debate with you and someone on my in another
I
episode.
welcome the opportunity, not because I'm interested in slam dunking, but because
Yes.
I'm truly interested in inviting folk into thinking about the historical context in which these texts were written, the ways in which the canon as we understand it today was in fact a political project, not a theological one, and think about the ways in which our pursuit of understanding the text has to be done with recognition of the fact that this text has gone through various iterations and translations. And if
Hmm.
we want to get to the truth, we have to begin that learning process and unlearning process of
Hmm.
inherited theologies.
Yes, unlearning is very important.
Yeah.
As I mature, I'm learning that I have to unlearn so many things, and I've never had to unlearn so much as I have in my early 40s.
Oh,
Um,
whoa, what? Not early 40s?
yes, early 40s.
Wow.
I had to emphasize the early.
Look, give me your skincare routine and regimen because it's working.
Water. That's that is. I want to talk about Pride in the Pews. Because that's you founded Pride in the Pews. What was the actual moment or need that made you start it back in, was it 2020?
That's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, uh, shortly after the George Floyd protests is when the idea for Pride in the Pews emerged. I was in Chicago as the city was literally on fire. And I was on the streets protesting and demanding for the justice of George Floyd, like so many other people across the country. And as I was doing that work, I saw an absence of the folks that raised and reared me, namely Black folk who considered themselves to be religious or considered themselves to be Christians or considered themselves to follow the way. And that really broke my heart because it's the Black church that taught me how to carry the banner for liberation. It's the Black church that taught me how to challenge empire and systems of oppression. Yet, as we're in the midst of this reckoning, I'm seeing an absence. And that invited me into critical reflection and conversation.
Hmm.
Because what I realized is that there, in that moment, were active tensions between the movement for Black lives and historic Black church leaders that were accustomed to leading civil rights movements.
Hmm.
And I was trying to figure out the source of that tension. And as someone who was both Black and queer and Christian, it was not lost on me that many of the folks leading the movement for Black lives identified as queer
Hmm.
and as trans and as non binary.
Mm.
And I had to ask myself if the resistance to following their leadership was not rooted in believing that they didn't have the right strategy or they didn't have the right approach, but resistance was rooted in the fact that they identified as a part of the LGBTQ plus community. And as you begin to look at many of the movements in response, right,
Hmm.
to the George Floyd protests led by clergy persons, they weren't saying the names of Black queer folk who died at the hands of state-sanctioned violence. They weren't naming the sort of levels at which Black trans women were being murdered and their murders going unsolved. And so for me, there appeared to just be a blind spot, a gap, right, in the prophetic voice of the Black church. And I wanted to do something about it. I believe that there were folks out there who were truly interested in standing with and alongside Black LGBTQ plus communities, but they were unable to do so because of inherited theology. Unable to do so because they grew up in a faith tradition that told them that queer folk and trans folk were not loved by God. And so I decided to pursue this project, Pride in the Pews, to rectify that issue, to change it, to produce a different kind of community that held space for those old school civil rights activists that have been through the trenches, and young Black, queer, and trans folk who honored that faith tradition but wasn't rooted in it because they didn't find space for it.
Yeah. I love this because I thought about the church's influence in my life. And I remember thinking about how Jesus chose people that you would never think that he would have chosen to
Yes.
be his voice.
Yes.
And I was thinking about like Mary Magdalene, and I was thinking
Yes.
about like
Yes.
Zacchaeus, the tax collector,
Yes.
or like Paul or Saul, was it Saul of
Yes.
Tarsus? You
Yeah,
know,
that's right.
yeah, I went to Creighton University, so I had to take a lot of theology classes.
Okay, because I'm saying you're calling the roll.
Yes,
You're calling
yes,
the roll.
yes. And I always think of those people, and it always gave me hope in a way, because I felt like if God can use anyone, regardless of whether they're a prostitute or a tax collector that's hated by everyone, why could he not use me, or why could he not use somebody else? Because and you learn that in church, that acceptance in church, but then it's so weird as I got older and I realized how much the church had influence in the political space and how they had influence in other areas, and people will follow them. In fact, I was a political science major, and we learned that the top two ways that people choose their ideology is church first and family, right? And so thinking about that, I'm like, how is this institution that has taught me about acceptance and Jesus purposely include, I mean, there were stories in the Bible that purposely showed you that he chose, like, in some cases, the bottom feeders to be able to help them and spread the word. And yet our churches are not embodying that same philosophy in their actions sometimes.
Yes. And herein lies the importance of us being fluent in faith. Because absent of that analysis, we don't understand the rise of Trump and white Christian nationalism. Absent of us being fluent in faith, we don't understand the emergence of Project 2025. And it is so frustrating for me because folks who don't consider themselves religious or presume that the work that we do with faith communities are only relevant to faith communities, I like to bring cases of marriage equality to them,
Mhm,
where the primary point of contention
mhm.
for why one should be able to discriminate against LGBTQ plus people in hospitals, in housing, in healthcare is because of their religion.
Mhm.
And so you don't have to be religious to be impacted by religious bigotry.
So true.
Because we recognize that faith communities are flexing their political power to shape and influence policy. And so for this queer family that doesn't go to church and doesn't care much about church, the way that they are being governed is informed and influenced by an evangelical Christian who believes that they should be able to decide who gets access to housing and to health care and who does not. And they're basing all of that, the law of the land, on religious belief. And so this is why, for me, I immediately began to see how faith was not simply relegated to the four walls of a church, but these ideas actually migrated and infiltrated state legislative houses, migrated and infiltrated the Supreme Court, migrated and infiltrated the White House, migrated and infiltrated institutions that govern our everyday lives, like public schools and local clinics, where now you have teachers saying, I'm not teaching about LGBTQ plus history because of my faith. Now you have doctors saying, I'm not going to provide you medical care or treatment because of my faith. And then you have judges who are saying, I'm not going to extend the right for you to marry because of my faith. And so if those of us who don't consider ourselves people of faith or religious decide that these are conversations that we don't need to be a part of, then it means that we are caught off guard by the effectiveness with which Project 2025 is implemented, the effectiveness with which Trump is not only elected once, but twice, the effectiveness with which the Supreme Court is actively dismantling our core rights. All of this boils back down and is reduced to the commodification and codification of white Christian supremacy. And that's why we need to be faith fluid. That's why we need to tackle this on multiple fronts and don't simply relegate the conversation to what the church is doing.
I'm so curious. How did you started Pride in the Pews, and then how did you sell the program? We're outlining all of these reasons of like why it's so difficult. How did you even bring that idea into fruition?
Yeah. You know, I have to be honest and say that I had presumed that getting particularly Black pastors and preachers on board with our programmatic offerings would be difficult. But what I actually discovered is that there were way more folks interested in the conversation than was immediately visible to me. And here's what I discovered in conversation. I discovered when I sat down with Black pastors that they said, this work is important. I think it's really valuable. And I have done the work of marriage equality. I've been a part of the coalitions to push this work forward. But what they told me was, when I did that work and I turned around and asked my LGBTQ plus colleagues to support me around the work that I was interested in doing, they didn't answer the call. And I said, whoa, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Pause on the play. You're saying that you were part of a marriage equality fight. You put your reputation and name on the line. And once that fight was won, when you went back to my queer and trans colleagues to support the work that you were doing, you didn't get a positive response. I said, I see what's happening here. I understand what's going on. Because the LGBTQ plus movement and its aims have largely been dictated by white gay men. These white gay men decided and determined that we know that we would have achieved equality if we have marriage equality. And so they decided to make that a key and critical part of the agenda. But when you actually ask Black queer folk, Black gay folk, what you wanted the agenda to be, you know what they said?
What?
We want a job. We need housing. We need food to feed our families. Marriage equality is not at the top of our list, but it became the center, right, of this campaign. And funders got behind it. White progressive churches got behind it. But it was not an agenda that centered the voices of Black LGBTQ plus folks who said we should not be expending our time and energy on marriage equality. We should make sure that folk can afford to stay in their homes, that folks can afford food on their table, that folks might be able to make sure that they can have access to a living wage. That's actually the most important thing to us. And so the disconnect that pastor was articulating was that there's something about the mainstream movement that was not receptive to thinking about our collective work intersectionally. And that was the critique that he lodged. And so I realized in that moment that if we wanted to do this work, we had to be clear that by helping us, you're helping everyone. By helping us, you're improving the entire community, as opposed to an identity-specific movement that didn't take into account intersectional issues. Right? And so for me, I wanted to approach the conversation with these pastors by saying, by making your churches more affirming, by creating space for LGBTQ plus communities, what you're actually doing is inviting opportunity for community-based partnerships. What you're actually doing is inviting opportunity for intersectional approaches to community wellness. What you're actually doing is expanding your worldview and lexicon to hold space for not only one form of diversity, but multiple forms of diversity. And so while it is true that you're engaging us around LGBTQ plus issues, because this work is intersectional, we're also going to invite you to think about how you treated women. We're also going to invite you to think about how you've treated disabled folks. We're also going to invite you to think about how you've treated poor folks. We're also going to ask you to think about how you've treated folk who may not subscribe to the same religious identity as you. And so while this may be your entry point, it's actually an invitation to a much broader conversation about belonging. And when I framed it that way, to say that I'm not trying to convince you or convert you to change your theology. You can do that, right? That's actually not our work. That's not our sneeze. But what we are interested in doing is acknowledging that there are places wherein our shared humanity has been replaced with tribal and ideological fights that don't make space for all of us. And what would it look like if we simply approach the stories of those who we see as other as sacred text, as believing that they have something to teach us? And if we approach it that way, we might leave changed. We might leave with a different set of views, not coming in trying to change you or tell you you're wrong or tell you you need a different view, but come in saying, my experience is not yours. And by listening to you, I believe that I might walk away better than when I came. I might walk away knowing more about what it means to be human than before I sat down with you. And that was a starting point. They said, well, I can do that.
I
Right?
love that.
Yeah. You're not asking me to
Yeah,
change my theology. You're not asking me to discard my beliefs. You're asking me to be in conversation.
yeah. And that conversation is actually helping you to fulfill missions that are usually what churches are the foundation of churches. So it's not like you're asking them to go walk on the moon or something. Like this is what churches are founded on. And so I love that how you phrased or reframed the narrative around that argument. And I'm curious because you were able to get churches on board with this, but I also saw that you had like institutions and things like Northwestern and other schools and like prestigious universities, Chicago public schools, and things that were on board with you. And I'm actually curious how that evolved. How did you go to Pride in the Pews to pivot toward Pride?
That's a great question. So, Pride in the Pews began with a storytelling project called Can I Get a Witness? And we spoke with 66 Black LGBTQ plus folk ranging from the age of 21 to 79 from 25 states. And we were curious about how their belief system and spirituality informed the way they move through the world. And we went in particularly interested in working with faith communities. But we came out realizing that they weren't just talking about faith. They were talking about their family. They were talking about their job. They were talking about equitable access to resources. They were talking about HIV diagnoses. They were talking about depression and anxiety. They were talking about what it meant to go to school and being queer and being trans. And they said, wow, a lot of what I experienced a lot of it came from the church. I had to carry that in all these other places that I move through the world. And
Hmm.
so for us, we began this work, right? But as we were doing this work, the thing we discovered was that religion was not simply about belief, it was a determinant of health.
Mm,
It determined health outcomes.
interesting.
So it wasn't just about whether or not somebody believed this thing or didn't believe that thing. We actually began to see in our research that when one grows up in a non affirming religious environment, they're more likely to commit suicide. We started to discover that when one grows up in a non affirming religious environment, they're more likely to engage in risky sexual behavior. When one grows up in a non religious environment, they're more likely to suffer from anxiety and depression. And so this wasn't just about belief. It was about informing, influencing, shaping health outcomes, not just for LGBTQ plus communities, but for all of us. Because when access to contraception and abortion is restricted because of religious rights, it's affecting health outcomes.
Oh, yes.
When
Yeah.
someone's unable to secure housing because of someone's religious belief, it's affecting health outcomes. When someone is unable to have access to employment and a steady job, it's impacting health outcomes. And so for us, it became really clear that if we really wanted to create an ecosystem where Black LGBTQ plus communities can flourish, we can't just work with the church. We have to work with the hospital systems and healthcare systems. We have to work with schools and local nonprofits. We have to work with civic institutions and organizations, because if they don't recognize the ways in which religion is acting as a determinant of health, then they will find themselves reproducing the same kind of harm. And so that meant that we needed to really broaden our scope, acknowledging that if we wanted to really fix this ecosystem, we couldn't just deal with one institutional actor. We had to be in conversation with all the other institutions that mediate the everyday lives of Black, queer, and trans people. And that's when we made the decision to move from Pride in the Pews to Toward Pride. Because we said any institution that purports to serve Black, queer, and trans people need to move toward pride. And if they move toward pride, they not only care for us, but they care for all.
Yeah. And is the approach of your, I guess, I don't want to call it like selling, but your model basically, how different does that approach have to be? Because, like, for example, healthcare and church are very different institutions to walk into. So, what has to change about your approach when you're training, I don't know, hospital staff versus congregations?
First and foremost, data. We have to leverage and utilize data. When I name increased anxiety, increased depression, increased suicidal ideation, and we connect that to the religious communities or faith communities that folks come from, that has to be backed up by data. Right. And so this is why Northwestern is funding us to do a study on religion as a social determinant of health. But this is also why we're in conversation with principals and teachers, because they recognize that even as they are in an LGBTQ plus affirming district, these schools sit in conservative faith communities. And so they have to figure out how to provide for the well-being of the student while they're in school, right, from 10 to 2, while navigating a religious context that does not believe that the school environment should be LGBTQ plus affirming. And so our work ultimately is rooted in, I argue, data. But the thing is, that data doesn't change. The source of that data are Black LGBTQ plus communities. That's the source of our data. And in some instances, we use story to make that case. In other instances, we use the biblical text to make that case. But when we talk about working with schools or healthcare systems and hospitals or nonprofit organizations, we are using empirical data, which shows us the increased risk that Black LGBTQ plus communities are at when they are in non-affirming environments. And for us, that has been a compelling argument because by and large, these institutions want to serve our communities. And if we invite them to hear from, learn from, listen to Black LGBTQ plus communities, they're going to discover that these communities care about faith, and they care about housing, and they care about jobs, and they care about family, and they care about those whom they love. And if you are really concerned about the health and well-being of this community, you have to be concerned about all of it. And you have to
Hmm.
make sure your institution is capacious enough to hold all of it. And so often these institutions get the LGBTQ plus part right, but they don't get the faith part right.
Hmm.
Or faith institutions get the faith part right, but they don't get the LGBTQ plus part right. And
Yeah.
so what we're saying is we never want LGBTQ plus folk to think that they are too much, too queer, too black, too religious. Instead, we want institutions to make themselves large enough to hold all of us. And that work has been really compelling for folks, and I think it's why they've said yes.
Yeah. And this is happening at a time when federal support for LGBTQ plus protections is pulling back right now. Um, what does that shift look like from where you sit?
Whew. We are in a deconstruction era where we are seeing the surgical dismantling of critical resources uh, across the board. And we are seeing marginalized communities, whether that's women, queer folk, disabled folk, folk living with HIV, being disproportionately impacted. And what we see is that there is a major gap between the need and resources. And because of what we're seeing on the federal level, we are seeing major organizations and institutions backpedal on their commitments to serving our community well. And that backpedaling has caused enormous and tremendous harm. We are already seeing data around the ways in which HIV rates and STI and STD rates are going up. We are already seeing the rates at which queer folk and trans folk are being unhoused or not being able to have access to housing. We are already seeing the increased rates in hate crimes against LGBTQ plus people. And so this hostile rhetoric and political environment is not only causing the stripping of resources, but also causing the stripping of safety for the
Hmm.
communities that we're interested in serving. And so that dismantling has forced us, compelled us organizationally to think about how we hold institutions accountable while also inviting them in to fill the gap
Hmm.
and to do so with an intersectional lens and analysis. Because now we're in a place where you can't say you're providing services to gay people. You can't say you're providing services to women. You can't say you're providing services to disabled folks. You have to say we're providing services to people.
Hmm.
You have to say we're providing services to humans,
Hmm.
right, in order to receive federal funds. And so the question then becomes, has our framing from the very beginning been too small? Has our framing from the very beginning been too limited? Because if we say we're only serving black folk, do we mean only certain kinds of black folk? When we say we're only serving LGBTQ plus folks, do we mean a certain kind of LGBTQ plus person? And so, in many ways, this nightmare that we find ourselves in is forcing us to break the box, right, of constrained and limited identity through which we've done our work. And so now we have to talk about the work intersectionally. Now we have to talk about the work as meeting the general need or the common good. And I actually think that's a good thing. I actually think that that invites us into radically reimagining the language of liberation, radically reimagining the language of justice. And
Hmm.
so we're seeing in this era collaboration and partnership that we would have never seen.
Yeah.
An LGBTQ plus organization and partnering with the church. What? That's wild. Right? We've never seen anything like that. But why are we seeing it? Because we see a common threat.
Mm.
source behind our camaraderie? What's the source behind these new burgeoning partnerships? It's recognizing that none of our humanity is being recognized.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's at this place where we're able to recognize that there's a common enemy. But here's the gag. There's always been a common enemy. That common enemy has always been white Christian supremacy, which didn't honor blackness, which didn't honor queerness, which didn't honor transness. That's always been the enemy. It's never been about one person, one individual. It's been about an insidious ideology, which has convinced us that it's those folk over there who are to blame for why we're living the way we're living. It's those folks over there who are to blame why we're behind on our liberation. But Trump and the emergence of a white Christian nationalist movement has actually showed us that we were all the target.
Well, they're living out loud now. Yes. So, I've noticed such a shift. I mean, it's been, not to get all political and everything, but I've just noticed such a shift in like the last decade where it just feels so much like we're going backward, and life just seems so much scarier now for me, for my nephews and nieces and my family. It's just, and other families, that it's kind of a scary place to be. And to see institutions that are trusted with caring for people, and guiding people, and really shepherding of souls, kind of, to like, that's a big responsibility that people are placing on a church. So for the
Yes.
church to be pushing you in a certain direction, and so one of my favorite books is Dante's Inferno.
I love it. Yes. Yes.
Love
I know
that
you well.
book. And it was so interesting to me how hell is laid out, right? I mean, for
Yep.
one, the lowest level of hell is actually ice, which was
Yes.
crazy. But what was interesting to me is some of the way that he weighted and categorized sin was very interesting to me, because certain sins, like you think, oh, murderers, or whatever, they're going to be in the lowest level. But where he really punished people in that book was people who were entrusted with caring and leading and guiding souls, um and were abused, that whether it was people that were, when you abused people's trust, particularly when it came to, the fact that they are putting the salvation of their soul in your hands in a weird way, and then you're impacting them by, you know, taxing them on things, and paying of indulgences and different things like that, right? That's what really surprised me about that book was, and so I've always looked at those kinds of sins a little bit differently. Because in Dante's mind, that was the most egregious sin, was got leading people, it was taking advantage of people that placed their trust in you and the salvation of their soul. And, and I see that in today's world, because people still blindly follow religion, and people still blindly follow white Christian nationalism. You might not even know that that's what it's called,
That's right.
you
That's
know,
right. That's
but
right.
they're following it, and it is influencing their decisions. It's influencing their perception of the world and
Yes.
their treatment of other people.
Yes.
And you have to get back to the core of what did Jesus say, for those who are Christian, right? What did Jesus say about, his commandments in the New Testament about, loving your neighbor as thyself, and things like that, where we get so caught up in these labels and this political stuff that we start to lose sight of really what the purpose of religion is.
Yes. Yes. And I would name that the real sin is the exploitation and demonization and subjugation of those whom we see as other. And that is a sin that, regardless of your faith tradition or no faith tradition, we all can commit. And so the invitation here is for the faith leader, but it's also for the clinician. It's also for the podcaster. It's also for the mother or father of a queer child to say, how do we make sure we don't commit the sin of dehumanizing those whom we see as other and create a world where we all might be able to collectively flourish? I am not interested in the economy of shame as a teaching tool. That actually doesn't serve us, whether that's white guilt or that is Black folk who are so rid with sort of disappointment in themselves about how they've treated folk or what they've done. I actually am not interested in you sitting in that place, right? Because it's not the most productive. It doesn't actually change the conditions, right, of our humanity or of those who are impacted, right, by these ideas. But the way that you can actually make a meaningful difference is dare to approach someone else's lived experience as if it's worthy of being heard, as if it's worthy of being held. And how do we create a world wherein no one's humanity is negotiable, where no one's truth is debatable, where they might be able to live into the fullness of who they are and have that honored and recognized? And so that for me is the work, because you bring up Dante's Inferno, and I think that's a really important one. But I'll bring one up that folks often use, even folk who aren't religious, by the way, often use Sodom and Gomorrah.
Oh, yes.
The Sodom and Gomorrah story is these two cities that were supposedly destroyed because of homosexuality. And this is one of those other instances where a literal reading of the text would leave you with a misguided interpretation and understanding. But what we actually see is that the reason why Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed was not because of homosexuality. It was because of greed. It was because of violence. It was because of the lack of hospitality. Those are the reasons Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. But how convenient is it for us to make that text about homosexuality something that indicts the perceived other, as in making that text about something that actually would indict all of us because we practiced it in some way? And so I think Dante's Inferno is in conversation with Sodom and Gomorrah and in conversation with what we're talking about today. And that is, the real sin is exploitation. The real sin is the dereliction of responsibility to care for the other. The real sin is endorsing systems of dehumanization and oppression. The real sin is refusing to see the humanity in your neighbor. That's the sin. And if we only believe that somehow religious folk can commit that sin, then I think we're missing the forest for the trees. Because I can tell you about a whole lot of CEOs who've committed that sin. I can tell you about a whole lot of EDs who've committed that sin. I can tell you about a whole lot of MDs and LCSWs who've committed that sin. And they all need to be invited into accountability and need to radically reimagine the way their systems, their disciplines, their orientations actually contribute to the nightmare that we find ourselves in. And if we only want to blame the church or blame white Christian nationalist movements or blame that person over there, then I think that we'll find ourselves here again in 10 years or 15 or 20 or 30, because we wouldn't have solved the real crux of the issue. And so for me, I think the work that I'm interested in doing, that I'm interested in the work of Toward Pride doing, is actually confronting what I call a care crisis. The belief that care is somehow and should be rationed, that care is only for some and not for others,
Mm-hmm.
that we should have to ration care, or that only some folk deserve care, or that there are some folks who shouldn't have care. But I wonder, what if care was an abundant resource? What if it was simply saying, I see you? What if it was saying, I bear witness to your truth and your lived experience? What if we refuse to live into this manufactured care crisis, which tells us that there's only enough to go around for some of us, but not all of us? And I think if we began to say, no, I'm not going to ration care. I'm not going to act as if care is a limited resource. I'm not going to act as if care only belongs to some communities and don't belong to others. No, I'm breaking that paradigm and saying that there's enough care to go around, and that care should not be conditional. That care is for anyone who wants it, anyone who needs it, and in fact, we shouldn't see it as a luxury, we should see it as a right. And how do we build institutions from that place? Seeing care abundantly, seeing care as a right and not a luxury, seeing care as the one thing that we can all give, no matter where we find ourselves in life, how much money is in our pocket, or the number of degrees that are behind our name.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And what can we expect next from Toward Pride?
Don't sleep on us. Okay, we are in the midst of some really exciting program. I'd love to lift up a program that we just started. We mentioned early in the conversation that I think we are in a deconstruction era. We're seeing the surgical dismantling of critical resources for communities that need it the most. And one of the communities that have been impacted disproportionately are folks who are living with HIV. We've seen the federal government strip funding and resources, which is really resulting in not only a rise in HIV cases, but the stripping of critical funding for medication that can prevent new diagnoses. And so the work that we're doing with Toward Healing is actually serving those living with HIV by connecting them with mental health practitioners and connecting them with sort of healthcare providers that can journey with them so that they might be able to live full, healthy, and thriving lives. So that project is one that we're really excited about. And I'll throw another one in there. That's a project that we're doing with Northwestern University, exploring religion as a social determinant of health. We are excited about partnering with a professor at the School of Public Health at Northwestern to make this data available so that we can actually show folks that faith informs health outcomes, and you don't have to be religious for that to be the case. We are all impacted by the legalization and weaponization of belief in the public square. And it has a deleterious impact, particularly on Black LGBTQ plus communities, and we're going to prove it.
Wow. That is the work you're doing is so needed. It's so amazing. It's so inspiring. Where can people learn more, get involved with Toward Pride, Toward Healing?
I want to invite you to visit our website at towardpride.org. If you're someone who's on social media, follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And as you visit our website, there'll be an opportunity for you to sign up for our newsletter as well. So I invite you to follow us there and stay connected to the work that we're doing.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being a guest today on the
Thank you for the
show.
invitation.
You just blew me away. And I was watching the time and I'm like, ooh, this episode is getting long and I have so many questions I want to ask him. I literally have a whole list of other questions that I didn't even get around to asking you. So I might have to actually ask you back for a part two.
Please, I would be delighted.
Yes, because I love this. I could have talked to you for a whole other hour. And there's so many people I want to introduce you to. I can't wait to share this podcast with some of my friends that I know are just going to love it. And I was thinking of them during different parts of what you were saying. It was like, ooh, I'm sending this to Jeff. I'm sending this to Brady. I'm sending this to Roy. I was like, this is just so great. So thank you again for being a guest on our show. And for those listeners out there, if you haven't already, please like, subscribe, share, and enjoy. We really want you to engage with our content. We're bringing great stories to the forefront, and check out Toward Pride. So thanks again, Don.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to you and for your audience for remaining curious and open to stories that they otherwise would not have heard.
Yes, definitely. Well, thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your day, night, evening. And until next time, this is Breaking Rank.